Okay, well, this is good.
Oh, great, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the first meeting of the Workgroup on Pandemic Spending that has been organized by the Comptroller's Office. Over the past 14 months, and I happen to be fortunate enough to be the Comptroller of the great state of Maryland, Peter Francho, but over the last 14 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed life, obviously, as we in Maryland and in the United States know it. Sadly, the virus has claimed the lives of nearly 9,000 Marylanders. It has separated us from the ones we love, changed the way we communicate with one another, and sadly, in many cases, made us desperately ill. On top of that, the necessary public health measures that were put in place plunged our economy into a crisis, forcing our economy to shut down, small businesses to close. More than 1 million Marylanders filed for unemployment first time. In response to these unprecedented twin crises, billions of dollars in both federal and state relief was made available for Marylanders and small businesses who were facing financial and economic devastation. This unprecedented infusion of federal aid was critical in staving off an economic calamity, both in Maryland and in the country. It was a lifeline to millions of Marylanders who found themselves out of a job, no fault of their own, on the verge of losing their homes, no fault of their own, struggling to put food on the table for their families. I believe that the dramatic stimulus measures were necessary, and in many instances, my only objection was that actually more relief could have been made available sooner. However, as the Maryland State Constitution mandates, the Office of Comptroller is charged with the general superintendence of the fiscal affairs of the state of Maryland. And in addition to that, the General Assembly recently tasked me specifically to do a top to bottom complete review of federal and state stimulus funds and to submit quarterly reports on the distribution and expenditure of those funds. I emphasize that what we're focused here on is learning lessons that we should have learned from how we have performed over the last 14 months. We have formed this work group to do the important work of oversight and accounting on the billions of taxpayer dollars that have been expended over the last 14 months. And I just emphasize, this is to learn what could be done better. Over the next year, this work group, along with experts from my agency, will conduct a series of public meetings on a wide range of topics to better understand how much money came in, where the money went, and the impact of the dozens of programs, grants, and loans that were established. These relief payments were meant for the pockets of Marylanders and hard-hit small Maryland businesses, not the pockets of pandemic profiteers and fraudsters. Over the upcoming months, this work group will receive presentations from state agencies, experts in spending and fraud, stakeholders who have been affected by the distribution of pandemic relief. I want to thank the Hogan administration for their commitment to work closely with us as we fulfill this critically important charge from the General Assembly. Each work group meeting will be open to the public, either via live stream or in person if circumstances allow. I hope the next meeting will be in person so that Marylanders can see firsthand how their money has been spent. I'm committed to a fully transparent process and accounting of the taxpayers' dollars in a positive way because I welcomed the relief funds. They were absolutely critical. But within that context, transparency and accountability are incredibly important. It's my pleasure today to receive presentations from Marc Nicole, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Management and Budget, and Mr. Andrew Schaufele, Director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. It's my hope that both presentations will provide an overview and summary of the pandemic spending efforts to date, as well as insight into the effects that COVID-19 continues to have on our economy. I'd like to just introduce the members of the workforce who are with us today. Deputy Comptroller Sharon Bernardi, who recently was voted the Tax Administrator of the Year in the entire United States of America. So God bless the fact that Sharon is here with us in Maryland. Director of our General Accounting Division, Sandy Zink. Director of Compliance Division, Chris Riley. The Director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, Andy Schaufele. And the Director of the Office of Risk Management, David Hildebrand. I appreciate everybody being with us today. And I'll just repeat it again. We have not had a lot of really public hearings on this. And the intent here is to have a positive use of information to improve the situation. It is not some kind of treasure hunt after something here and something there. We are interested in improving the response. Sharon, if you want to give a short comment on behalf of your colleagues, I'd appreciate it.
Recognition of that award, and it's actually a testament to the hard work of all of the employees within the Comptroller's office. So thank you. And as you said, we have undergone such a challenge over this past year, and the agency has worked with fellow state agencies to address the recovery efforts in Maryland, including issuing state stimulus payments and unemployment insurance grants. So on behalf of the Comptroller Workgroup members, I just want to reiterate our commitment to gathering the information necessary to meet the requirements that we have been statutorily charged to execute. And we look forward to learning more about the spending of these funds. And thank you for the opportunity to serve.
Thank you. And if I can get unmuted for a minute. Host is unmuted. Great. Okay, so I'm back. I would just like to welcome the Deputy Secretary, Marc Nicole, for being here. Marc, go ahead, begin and finish your presentation. We may ask a few questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, members of the work group. I am going to share my screen with you now so that everyone can see my presentation. Give me 1 second. And is that showing up or no? I am not seeing my presentation showing up as one of the yeah. It worked earlier when we practiced. Hold on 1 second. Okay, share screen. All right, I'm going to try something else. Is that working?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Alan, are you able to put the presentation up on the
Give me 1 minute.
All right, thank you. Sorry.
If it's easier, I can share it and steer.
Okay. That if you have, yeah, I think you have it, Andy. That would be fine.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Thank you. Why don't you go to full screen if you can, Andy? All right. Sorry for the delay, everyone. So the presentation here will focus on information that the state receives from a nonprofit organization called Federal Fund Information for the States, FFIS. They're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. They were established originally by the National Governors Association, the National Conference on State Legislatures, and they work closely with all of those groups in addition to the National Association of State Budget Officers. So if you go to the next page, I'm going to try to start by giving you sort of a variety of sort of different cuts of the information that we have received from this group. So next page. So in total, I think we've received in pandemic relief spending across federal and state programs over $60 billion as a state. Just to put that in perspective a little bit, our state general fund budget is about $20 billion, and our total fund budget is over $40 billion. So in the last year and a half, we've gotten an amount in excess of what we get in an entire year. And this has come across a couple of different areas. There is non-grant funding, and I'll sort of talk about that, about $36 billion. This is money that comes to individuals or businesses, but not necessarily through the state government. There's grant funding, that's funding that will come through the state budget. And then there's programs that we've started at the state, the tax relief that was provided through the Relief Act that was passed in February, and a variety of grant funding programs that have been generally supported with the state's rainy day fund or with other tax dollars. Next slide, please. So in this particular slide, I'm just trying to show everyone that, the money began flowing from the federal government to the state. Really early on, there were three pieces of legislation that passed last March, all that provided funding to the state. That was sort of updated with the Paycheck Protection Program in April, the Consolidated Appropriations Act in December, and then the American Rescue Plan Act that just passed in March. Just to put it into perspective, for these particular programs, if you look at the grant funding, about half of all that grant funding came through the American Rescue Plan Act. The next big chunk of money was through the CARES Act. All right, so next slide, please. And here is a summary of the federal non-grant funding program funds that we've received, the $36 billion or so. We've gotten economic impact payments. These are the sort of stimulus payments that Marylanders have received, over $10 billion for that. Pandemic unemployment compensation, over $10 billion for that. Maryland businesses have been able to claim over $10 billion worth of Paycheck Protection Program. I think generally all of these estimates are fairly conservative estimates. And if I had to say, I would probably say the total of the funding received by the state of Maryland in non-grant is probably well in excess of the $36 billion that I spoke about on the first page. But this is what we're tracking from federal fund information for the state. So next slide, please. So here's a summary of the federal grant funding that we have received. So of the $23.6 billion, the sort of biggest piece of that is state fiscal relief. This really has come through two separate pots of money. We've received $3.7 billion from the state and local fiscal relief fund through the American Rescue Plan Act. I'll call that going forward ARPA. And then we received $1.2 billion for the state from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. I'll call that CRF going forward. Next big chunk of money is local fiscal relief. Once again, this is broken up into two pieces, $2.3 billion from the ARP and about $1.1 billion from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And so this money for the local dollars is for Some is received directly, and some of that money has flowed through from the state. K through 12 education has received over $3 billion. This has come really in sort of three pieces of the original money in the CARES Act, some additional money in the Consolidated Appropriations Act in December, and then a very sort of large sum of money through the American Rescue Plan. Transportation's gotten $2.1 billion. Most of this money has been made available for mass transit programs. Airports and highways have both gotten a small piece, but 1.8 billion of that has been for mass transit, and really needed given the sort of lack of ridership and the need to sort of continue vital transportation services. Healthcare provider relief has totaled 1.9 billion. These are payments that have been made to hospitals, nursing homes, doctors, and other healthcare providers, really to sort of get them through the pandemic. We've also received $1.2 billion in enhanced Medicaid match since January of 2020. And that's our estimate going through the end of the current calendar year. So Maryland is a state that normally receives a 50-50 match with the federal government. As a result of the enhanced match, we are now getting 56.2% on the state. And then finally, $1.1 billion has been made available for higher education. This is both public universities, private universities, it's community colleges, and it's also some proprietary education schools. So next slide, please. And then here are some of the smaller amounts, although that's really not really an appropriate word there, because smaller, these are all very sort of large sums of money. Testing, tracing, vaccinations, $986 million. Rent and mortgage assistance, $967. So that is a little over $700 million for rental assistance. The Hogan administration worked with members of the General Assembly earlier this year on a sort of task force to begin allocating that money out to the local governments, and most of that money, at least on the rental piece, will be administered by county governments. Public assistance, this is a lot of the costs of PPE. It's setting up the hospitals and the mass vaccination sites. A lot of that is in here too. There's some lost wage assistance that the federal government was able to provide too. Child care assistance and provider relief, a very sort of critical industry to making sure that Marylanders can get back to work, almost $686 million. And then there's about $1.4 billion in sort of, I've called everything else, but really it's a lot of things. It's housing assistance, it's energy assistance, it's water assistance, helping folks pay their water bills. It's programs, meal programs for seniors. It's mental health and substance abuse services for those folks really struggling during the pandemic. It's money for homelessness programs and child welfare. It's just a variety of programs. A lot of this money is being sort of administered by all of sort of the relevant federal agencies. A lot of the money on the previous page is coming through the United States Treasury. So the sort of pots of money are sort of flowing from many different sources. So next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act, and in particular the state fiscal relief portion of that. So that totaled for Maryland $3,717 million. Governor Hogan and the presiding officers of the General Assembly announced a plan in March of this year to sort of allocate that funding across a variety of different areas to sort of benefit the state. That announcement was made, like I said, in March, included $1.1 billion to stabilize the UI Trust Fund. Before the pandemic started, Maryland had almost $1.3 billion in our trust fund. I believe the current balance in that fund is negative. So we are borrowing from the federal government to make those payments. So we're also allocating $800 million of that money that we're going to get for existing pandemic relief programs that we've already begun to establish, like the Recovery Now program, which I'll talk about shortly, to help cover the economic impact payments that were made as part of the Relief Act. The legislation is also the ARP is also going to provide $600 million to support school reopening. A lot of this funding was included in supplemental budgets that were submitted to the General Assembly in March of this year. So there's lots of money around summer programs and helping students with learning loss and making sure that we are able to reopen all our schools come this fall. Governor and the General Assembly leaders agreed to some major investments in both transportation services and broadband, $500 million for transportation, $300 million for broadband. The broadband money is sort of broken up into a variety of sort of different pieces. About half of that is going to go for critical infrastructure to make sure that we can get broadband access to all Marylanders. And then some of it is going to be used to make help those folks that are having difficulty, paying for those services and getting devices with that. There are some federal programs that we're going to partner up with to make sure that Marylanders that need devices and access have the ability to get those. We're making $300 million available to supporting Marylanders in need. This is a variety of different programs. So both Governor Hogan and the General Assembly have, increased benefits to Marylanders who are on temporary cash assistance or temporary disability assistance. Both of those populations are receiving additional funding of $100 a month. That funding was supposed to expire at the end of the current fiscal year. We're taking that out to the end of the calendar year, I believe. And then we're making available some money for apprenticeship training programs, some more money for utility assistance. And we are setting aside about $100 million to help sort of those state employees who have been working on the front lines throughout the pandemic with additional response pay. And we're going to continue that response pay through the end of December of this year. So next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit about the State Tax Relief Act of 2021 that was passed in February of this year, made about $1.4 billion of assistance available to Marylanders really in need. And it did this in a sort of variety of ways. The governor introduced this act in January, said this was the most important piece of legislation that the state needed to pass this year. The General Assembly agreed with him, and we were able to pass this particular piece of legislation, and I would say what seemed like record time. And this is sort of the highlights on the tax side. The next page we'll talk about some of the spending parts of the bill. We've provided enhanced earned income credit benefits for both families and individuals. The family benefit has gone from 28% of the federal credit to 45% of the federal credit. We're doing this for 3 years. So 396 is sort of the value over 3 years. But you see 1/3 of that is something that many Marylanders have already received. We introduced a provision to waive the income tax on unemployment benefits. That will be done for the next 2 years. It is capped at folks receiving benefits who have income of less than $75,000 for individuals and $100,000 for families. The General Assembly also enacted a sort of piece of legislation along with the Relief Act that provided similar benefits for immigrants who don't have the appropriate tax filing status. The The Relief Act also provided an enhanced sales tax vendor discount, where vendors that collect the sales tax on behalf of the state were allowed to keep some of that. So most vendors were allowed to keep up to $3,000 for 3 months. That's $186 million. The governor introduced an economic impact payment that would be made to all Marylanders who had received an earned income tax credit in tax year 2019. That benefit was either $300 or $500. And I would say as soon as that piece of legislation passed, the Comptroller's office did a great job and got that $180 million out immediately to Marylanders really in need. And then there's as I mentioned, there's a couple of other little pieces there. Next slide, please. On the state grant funding side, we've provided money over a series of times. So I'm sort of working from the most recent sort of back, at least for some of this. So as part of the Relief Act, there was a provision included there to provide $306 million of support for critical programs. We've provided business assistance the governor announced in November and December that totaled $250 million. Through the spring and summer of last year, governor announced another about $250 million of assistance there. And as I mentioned previously, I believe this was in November, the governor announced an enhanced TANF benefit of $100 a month for individuals receiving TANF. Now, for that, I would say, before the pandemic started, Maryland's TANF rolls were around $30,000 a month, and I think right now we're somewhere in the range of $66,000. So you can see the real impact that the pandemic had on Marylanders. A lot more individuals really needing assistance from the state. Finally, the governor also accelerated some provider rate increases that were supposed to start in July of 2021. He thought it was important to make sure that providers could continue helping Marylanders in need of assistance. So he provided those rate increases 6 months early, and they started in January of this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Recovery Now Fund was created as part of the Relief Act. So it's supported by $306 million that was transferred from the state's rainy day fund. The fund supports 34 programs that are administered by 16 different agencies. The legislature, when they passed the Relief Act, included a provision that requires every 2-week reporting on this spending. And so we have been providing those reports. They're on the DBM website. If you go to dbm.maryland.gov, one of the sort of tags over there says Recovery Now. You can see the every 2-week reports, although I would say yesterday's report was delayed because of a technology malfunction that I had yesterday. So it hopefully will get posted later today now that I have my technology working again. So if you go to the sort of next 3 pages, one of the things that we did for the first time, or actually 4 pages, you go 1 page at a time. So move forward. You can see some of the programs that are supported. So the agencies that have sort of the bulk of the funding here are the Departments of Commerce and Housing and Community Development. So as I said, there are 34 total programs. In the report that's going to be posted later today, hopefully, or tomorrow at the latest, we've, for the first time, have sort of shown how we're doing with sort of spending all our money. So you see the allocation that each program received through the legislation. You can see the awards that have been made, and then most of the programs have at least awarded funds, and they are beginning to disperse funds, and particular programs are sort of beginning to spend those dollars. So for instance, for hotel grants, this is money that's going to be managed by county governments. So we've provided that money to the county governments. We've dispersed almost all of the money out to the counties. I believe there's one county left that hasn't signed their grant agreement. And about $2.5 million of that has been made available to various hotels. And you can see there's a sort of variety of, programs that are sort of similar to that. So if you sort of move to the next page, you can see a little few more of those. For instance, in this disparity grant, this was money for 3 counties. That money was managed by DBM. We've made the money available to those 3 counties already. We're providing money for food banks, the temporary disability assistance payments. This is where the General Assembly follow the governor's example to enhance a benefit by an additional $100 a month. We did that for the temporary cash assistance. They've done it for the temporary disability assistance payments. And this also brought back some folks that may have been prematurely removed from the roll. So those folks have been brought back, and they are now being allowed to continue receiving that benefit through the end of the current calendar year, current fiscal year. Next slide, please. Okay, so you see there's a few more here. We're providing monies to local workforce development boards. I will note this pending UI claims. This is an area where on a monthly basis, the Department of Labor is making a report available to your staff, Mr. Comptroller, to provide $1,000 payment to those individuals who are in what I am calling sort of UI limbo. And we've made $33.8 million worth of those payments so far. We've got programs helping rural and farm communities through the Maryland Agricultural Resource-Based Development Corporation. We're providing assistance to developmental disability providers and other social service providers. Next slide, please. And so then we've provided some money to the Maryland Department of Transportation for more transit funding, some assistance with highways. We're going to provide grants to volunteer fire companies. The community colleges have received some money, as has Baltimore City Community College. We've got some utility assistance and then some other rural and agricultural grants. In total, $306 million. So far, we've awarded about 60% of that, $178 million. About a little less than half of that's been dispersed, and a little over 30% of that has actually spent and gotten out into the hands of, those needy Marylanders and businesses that are seeking assistance. We plan on updating this report every 2 weeks, and we are in, I would say, constant communication with all these agencies on how they're doing and how they're moving forward with their programs. Next slide, please. And so here's the listing of the assistance that was provided back in November and December. We provided assistance to restaurants, hotels, and hospitality industry, small business grants. So as you see, some of these are sort of more targeted: restaurants, hotels, small business grants. This was sort of an application process. We have made money available for entertainment venues. Department of Labor set up a layoff aversion program that was very successful. They started that last April, and we funded it again last November. We've made available additional money for minority business grants, Main Street organizations, arts and tourism groups, and other rural businesses. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's the sort of assistance back from the spring and summer of 2000. We made available almost $180 million for small business grants and loans. A lot of those loans that were originally made have been converted into grants. When we received federal guidance last fall that said that was an allowable use of the loan funding, we converted all the loans into grants. We've had the Department of Housing and Community Development run a nonprofit recovery initiative that's helped arts organizations. It's helped behavioral health and developmental disability providers, as well as a host of other nonprofit organizations sort of get through the pandemic. Governor has made available funding for farm and other agricultural support programs that have run through both the Maryland Department of Agriculture and Marbidco for about $8 million. And then the layoff aversion grants, some more minority business funding. Governor set up a program early on in the pandemic to provide funding for those businesses that could sort of retool to sort of help with the sort of immediate needs of the pandemic. So, creating PPE, masking, getting hand sanitizer out and available. And then there's a variety of sort of smaller programs of $4 million. I would say, once again, I've sort of gone through a pretty comprehensive list here, but I would say even if you sort of look back at the state budget that we introduced, there's probably a variety of items that we could say sort of qualified as pandemic assistance that were provided throughout the ingoing budget. And then through the governor's 5 supplemental budgets, I would say if we would count that up, we could find a lot of other assistance that was or could be said to have been pandemic related assistance. I just try to sort of hit the sort of the high levels for you. And I guess I'm happy to take any questions that you might have on this presentation or on other matters related to pandemic spending.
No, thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary, because as I said, this is an effort really for the first time to take a look at everything. And as I reiterate, I think everybody is in agreement that the relief from the feds and the state has been indispensable. But we all want to emphasize transparency and accountability simply because that's what the public deserves. It's their money, be it federal tax dollars or state tax dollars. And I just want to thank you for beginning the process, because this is really a top to bottom review, and it's going to require obviously some more time, but I wanted to thank you for getting us off to a good start. I know you're busy. I appreciate everything that you have presented to us today as far as the cooperation and partnership with the work group and allowing us to begin to pull together jointly with you and the legislature and others and kind of a complete summary of where the dollars went. And for example, did they really help people that needed a lot of help? Was there more than the normally expected amount of fraud? Because there's always fraud. Was there an egregious amount, and could we figure out ways to protect ourselves down the road? And then I mentioned this profiteering or gouging the treasury of the state of Maryland or the U.S. government by the private sector. I'm not suggesting there is some of that. I'm just saying these are important things, and you have started us in a very comprehensive way. And I just want to reiterate, I welcome the federal and state relief. I welcome what you have done, Mark, and all of the agencies. But what we're doing, I think, is going to be very helpful. My first question is just a process question. When deciding how much money should go to each of these programs and to what agency, what exactly was the process? Was it a request from the individual agencies? Was it from the citizens affected by the economic consequences? Was it something, and I'm not challenging any of the allocations, I'm just wondering what the process was as far as you and the governor and the secretary deciding how much was in each bucket?
Well, sure. So let me maybe first I'll sort of talk about sort of the federal allocations. I'll talk a little bit about the state sort of afterwards. So the federal dollars were allocated, the monies that came through the coronavirus relief fund were sort of a population-based allocation across all the states, although there was a floor at $1.25 billion for all the states. So no state could get less than $1.25 billion. And so that was the original one. The second one was sort of a two-piece allocation. Every state got at least $500 million, and the sort of rest of the funding was sort of allocated based upon unemployment rates. So that was sort of, the federal dollars have been very formula based. I would say the state spending has sort of been something that's sort of really been sort of driven by lots of conversations, that individuals have had with the governor's office about the need for assistance in a sort of variety of areas, right? And then it's also sort of a discussion amongst the agencies about sort of where the needs are out in the community. And so that was, I would say that's probably a good description of how sort of the coronavirus relief funds. And then I would say the allocations around the American Rescue Plan dollars was a sort of very lengthy and series of conversations that we've had with members of the General Assembly in the sort of weeks after the passage of the American Rescue Plan about, what is the best way to spend $3.7 billion? A lot of sort of give and take with the General Assembly, and sort of putting that sort of very sort of comprehensive, proposal forward.
Excellent. How many pandemic relief programs were established with state funds, for example, ballpark?
Well, so just like in the Recovery Now piece of legislation, there were 34. I think, a lot of those were sort of duplicative of things that had already existed. So I think if you go and add and you look at sort of like, for instance, the nonprofit recovery initiative that Department of Housing and Community Development did, even though that was only one program, they sort of targeted at sort of multiple sort of different industries. I could say that, might be somewhere in the area of sort of 50 or more of those state related programs.
Excellent. And you mentioned the rainy day fund and the withdrawal. Was that the total amount that was taken out of the rainy day fund? And are they being replaced by federal dollars, or what's the plan there?
Well, so that is part of the plan. And I think one of the things that we're doing right now at DBM is we're going through the new guidance that the federal government just released around the American Rescue Plan about the allowable sort of uses of funding. And one of the things that they noted in there is that they want really a lot of the spending to sort of be forward looking, right? So there's a sort of a date in the bill of March 3rd, 2021. So to the extent that dollars are spent after March 3rd, 2021, they will allow you to use those federal dollars. So like the Recovery Now program that was established as part of the Relief Act, $306 million from the Rainy Day Fund. I think we will be allowed to use the federal government's funding to support that program and leave the $306 million in the Rainy Day Fund. We were hoping, I think, to use that money to support some of the $250 million that we took out of the Rainy Day Fund back in November and December. That's a little bit more unclear, because that certainly it looks like at least a good part of that spending was before that March 3rd date. We're trying to figure out whether or not there are sort of other provisions of the American Rescue Plan that allow us to sort of cover that. But I would say those are the two big pieces. And then the very sort of early on, that first announcement the governor made to start some of those programs from the Rainy Day Fund, I believe it was like $125 million in business loans and grants last April. We originally used monies from the state rainy day fund for that. But after we received the coronavirus relief funds, we used those funds and put the rainy day funds back where they came from. So it's sort of, the nice thing is, so we've saved enough early enough so that we could use our money to start programs quickly. And then the federal government sort of came in and said, hey, you can use some of our money to support sort of what you've done. So we are able to keep some of our money, but I think in the end, we'll probably end out spending some of our rainy day fund.
Okay, that's excellent. And then I guess I'm alluding to the same restrictions that are saying are somewhat in formation or in play. But what are some of the, what is your sense of where we are as far as restrictions placed by the federal government, and are they dispersing all of this in lump sums, or are we getting it in segments?
Sure. So we received last year, when we received the coronavirus relief funds, we got those all as one payment. We're currently in the process right now of setting up all our sort of financial systems to receive the American Rescue Plan dollars. The guidance that came out last week said that states that had unemployment rates that were 3% or more than 2% higher than when the pandemic started would be able to receive all their money all at once. And so once sort of the federal government sort of looks at all our sort of paperwork, I expect that we will be getting a $3.7 billion wire transfer. I'm hoping within the next week or so.
Excellent. And if there's a balance remaining after all of the dust settles, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there a process on how you're going to spend that, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know that we really, I guess since well, sort of on the coronavirus relief funds. So those funds are good through the end of December of this year. And we have committed to the legislature previously that we will not turn back any of those funds. There are sort of abilities to sort of use those, for stabilizing uninsurance trust funds and a variety of other sources. So we're going to make sure that money gets all spent. I mean, we're just so early on in the American Rescue Plan sort of evaluation, but and for that money, we really have through December 31st of 2024. So we're really looking at 3.5 more years to spend all of that money. Now, the plan that we sort of worked through with the General Assembly had us spending, I would say, most of that money by the end of fiscal year 23, right? So I think, we all sort of feel that, to get out of the pandemic, we need to sort of spur the economy, help, individuals in need of assistance. And the best way to do that is to get that money out as quickly as we can.
Got it. Just on an accounting issue, the feds sometimes require audits, sometimes they don't. What is the situation as far as your ability or the state's ability through its individual agencies to keep track of federal dollars?
Sure. So I'll talk to you a little bit about, I already talked to you about sort of what we're doing with recovery now with the 2-week reporting, but under the coronavirus relief funds, the federal government has made us do reporting on a quarterly basis. So any grant or item of spending above $50,000 needs to be reported on a quarterly basis. We expect that we'll probably have a very similar reporting requirement under the sort of American Rescue Plan Act that just passed. I mean, we've gotten a little bit of guidance on that so far, but I think there's probably more to come. Well, one of the things that did come out in the guidance is that the state will need to do an annual performance report for the federal government. And then after it submits that performance, it will have to sort of post that information on their website. I would note, Mr. Comptroller, that our state's outside auditor, Clifton CLA, I forget the last two. Last one I think is Allen. I don't know what the L is for. But so your outside auditor has been sort of working with some of our state agencies, and as it's sort of reviewing our books, has been asking them a sort of variety of questions, and we're trying to be as responsive as we can with them. We are working with the agencies, and I think we're going to begin to set up a process to do some, I guess what you'll call, maybe you'd call them sort of desk audits, where we sort of send out sort of an audit team to go and look at, particular items of expenditure in various programs, and making sure that the agencies have the appropriate documentation that supports the expense.
Well, I just want to conclude by thanking you again, because obviously you're on top of this situation, and it's got all sorts of implications, obviously, as far as the future, because who knows whether it continues in some form or another. And also, as I mentioned, the necessity for us to, we're going to ask for a lot of data, and you are going to help us, I think, fulfill our statutory mandate of oversight and accounting. This is all good news to the extent we can work together on this. And thank you very much for getting us off to a good start. I would like to have the other members of the work group be able to ask questions. And Sharon Bernardi, if you wanted to perhaps start off, if you have anything. We're going a little bit, because of my many questions, we are a little bit behind the clock here. But, I'm just very happy that we got off on this footing, Mark, and thank you for
You're welcome.
this. We're going to need a lot more down the road, obviously, and our members, I'm going to let our task force members ask a question or two, and then we'll move on to Mr. Schaufele. Sharon?
Thank you, sir. And I guess isn't really a question because the presentation was so thorough. I just asked that the Deputy Secretary, if you see any best practices or you have conversations with any of your associates in your national organizations such as NASBO that could be helpful for the work group and what we're doing for the state, if you could share that information with us, we greatly appreciate it.
We'd be happy to.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Yes, sir. And thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary. You had mentioned that some of the funding from the feds did have audit or extra reporting requirements. Did any of those funding allocations make it so that it's a funded mandate? We have the funding, the ability to conduct those audits that you were talking about, or is that unfunded? And at what point are we expecting kind of the full burden of all of these audits to hit? And do you have any information on us for that?
So I would say generally, at least for the, and it has been quite a sort of burden to sort of do a lot of this reporting. I would note that for like the very first CRF report that we did, we were entering, I don't know, I want to say like tens of thousands of lines of data where we provided grants like over $50,000, right? We had, so there, the health department was using some contractors to sort of support that. But those are allowable expenses that we're using federal dollars to reimburse.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. And our head of our Sandy Zink, the very important accounting division of the state. If you have any questions, Sandy, obviously we can ask questions offline, but go ahead if you have a couple of questions.
I just had one very simple question. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the things as I've sat and listened, obviously our groups have worked very closely together to try and disperse the funds as you've mentioned. My question to you is, as you're planning the budgets for next future fiscal years, having learned from what has gone through this year and the crisis, are you planning to invest and have more money budgeted for healthcare related costs as a result of all of the crisis that we've just been through?
Yeah, I don't know that I think the healthcare costs, so something that sort of varies a lot. Clearly, I think one of the things that both Maryland and lots of other states have seen the pandemic is really the need to, and maybe we haven't done enough of this in the past, is to make sure that we have enough sort of mental health and substance abuse services available for Marylanders that are really sort of struggling with this. And I think there certainly will be some sort of after effects as we sort of, begin getting to normal. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a little more spending in sort of that area than if you'd sort of looked at the normal trend previous to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. And Chris, could you finish up before we get to Mr. Schaufele with anything from the compliance division?
Absolutely. Thank you, Deputy Secretary, and I do appreciate the in-depth discussion about the Recovery Now funds, and the transparency there was very excellent. But the question is that I have, do you have a timetable, or is there a feeling when all of the allocated funds will actually be dispersed and spent? I know you're saying that you're monitoring it every 2 weeks, but what's your feeling on when it actually will all get out the door?
Right. So the legislature in the piece of legislation sort of tasked us to make sure all that spending was out the door by the end of June of this year. Now, there was one particular piece in there where they gave one agency sort of an exception that was around the health enterprise zone. So I think that was like a $14 million item. That is sort of related to a piece of legislation that passed this year to sort of set up those going forward. So they have a little bit longer to spend. But I'm guessing the way I'm looking at it is, for instance, say the local workforce investment boards, right? It was $7 million there. We have provided those grant dollars to the local workforce boards. I believe there are 13 of those across the state. So technically, even though we're not showing that as sort of spent, but on the state books, it's kind of spent. It's sort of with those local workforce boards now. But what we're going to do, even though those are sort of all off the state books, we are trying to monitor how that money is getting out there. So that money might take a little bit longer to spend, right? Because it's at the local level. But once again, I think the goal here, and certainly on workforce training, is, we've had lots of Marylanders who have lost employment. We need to give them new skills, retrain them, and provide additional opportunities. And so we want to make sure that, that money gets spent pretty quickly. We've been sort of doing that same sort of monitoring with the community colleges. They've set up a lot of very interesting sort of programs where they're giving sort of scholarships for sort of people trying to get back into the workforce.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. And Mark, again, my sincere thanks. Your presentation has been terrific and gotten us off absolutely in the right direction. And thank you for the time. Give my regards to your colleagues. And we're going to move to Mr. Schaufele, if that's okay with everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much. We're going to talk to Mr. Schaufele about the economic impact of pandemic relief programs in Maryland.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Comptroller.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Nicole. I enjoyed the presentation. I hope to follow it up. I'm just going to shift my screen around and start sharing. Okay. You should see my screen now. There we go. This slide really illustrates the course of the pandemic from the state's revenue perspective. So I find it useful for this group. You have the 3 fiscal years that we've really dealt with on the revenue estimating side across the top there, fiscal year 20, 21, and 22. And those are the dollar amounts across the top quarter of the chart there. And then we see the progression of how those dollars changed over a period of time. So for example, in fiscal year 2020, we got together and we had a baseline and a pessimistic approach in May. In March, we knew that COVID was on the horizon. We didn't really know a whole lot about it. So we decided to take no action at that meeting and to, gain some more experience and information before we touched the revenues. And that's what we did in May. And we were looking at writing down revenues between 5 and 6% for fiscal 20. And if you look all the way out to fiscal 22, we were talking about a write down in the range of between 13% and 20%. Just huge impacts. And that was really built on the premise that there would be a drag out labor market recovery. That COVID, and when it hit, by the second month, we had lost 400,000 jobs in the state of Maryland. And those were jobs that tended to be in industries that were directly impacted by COVID. So jobs that really deal in face-to-face, especially in the service sector. And the thought was that the impact in those sectors would then spread out and begin to impact other sectors. And we'd see a very long, drawn-out labor market recovery. We knew at the time that the feds were taking this very seriously and were pumping money. At this point in time, we had the CARES Act. But quite frankly, we did not have the confidence that they'd be able to pull off everything that they had sought to in that bill. Most notably, getting the unemployment dollars and the stimulus checks out the door. I had thought that that would take quite a long period of time to actually occur, and indeed it did not. So then you can see by September, we began to feel better about the pace of the recovery and the depths of the recession. And it really has occurred iteratively all the way up to this most recent March estimate, where the current fiscal year 2021, we're off just 185 million relative to our pre-COVID estimate. And for fiscal 22, we're up 161 million relative to our pre-COVID estimate. It's like it didn't occur in terms of our revenue estimates. Monetary policy had a significant effect right off the bat. The Federal Reserve set its interest rate target at effectively 0. They went straight into quantitative easing, buying bonds to help shore up interest rates. And I think most importantly is they gave forward guidance. This is not something that the Federal Reserve has often attempted to do. You don't want to talk about the future unless you have to. But by promising to keep that rate low, and also saying explicitly that they weren't going to stick completely to the inflation target, that if inflation ran a little hot, they would let it run a little hot, since we've been behind for so many years during the prior expansion. And I think that gave the business community tremendous confidence that the Federal Reserve was going to be there to backfill the economy. And they did that through various lending programs as well. So Federal Reserve response was significant, well-timed, and effective, in my opinion. Mark went through the major COVID-19 bills, so I won't stick to these, but these are there as artifacts from this work group. More than $5 trillion in federal spending went out the door in an amazing period of time. If you look back to the Great Recession, which was completely different, it's a financial recession versus this is a health-induced recession, less than $1 trillion. And I'll show you some charts that really show how small the blip was during the Great Recession compared to what we're seeing now. This is a look at the amount of dollars that have flowed into Maryland. We've cobbled this together from various sources, but we feel very comfortable in these numbers. And you can really see where the dollars began to hit. The most significant amount of money to come into Maryland right off the bat were the stimulus checks. I mentioned early on that we had great concern, these checks flowed through the IRS, that they wouldn't be able to stand up a system to make these disbursements very quickly. But lo and behold, they did. The bulk of that money was out in the month of April and in folks' checking accounts there to stimulate demand in the economy. And then you saw the unemployment insurance really start to roll out the door. That was significant. All the way out to where we are in March, you can see the most recent stimulus payments that went out the door, almost $6 billion into the state of Maryland. All in all, we have an estimate right now that we think by the time that the ARPA finishes up, it'll be 45 to 50 billion. I'm with Mark. I think we could probably revise that up somewhere in the 55 to 60 billion range. But nonetheless, I thought Mark made a very good comparison there. And, the state's budget is about 45 billion. It's like having the state spend an entire amount of money on top of its normal amount. One other way to put that is 45 to 50 billion dollars is equal to the state's largest private sector industry, which is professional and business services. Our lawyers, our accountants, our engineers, very high paying. It's like we created that industry overnight and just flushed that money into the Maryland economy. And it has worked. Looking at unemployment, this really helps to illustrate where that worked. At the peak point in time, we had 1.3 million Marylanders claiming unemployment insurance. Again, to put that in perspective, that's 22% of the entire population. It's 33% of the working age population. So a third of Marylanders were finding themselves in seeking unemployment. The orange bar or orange shading there is very significant. That's the pandemic unemployment assistance. Very important there was that unemployment was expanded to not just include workers that earn wages, but also workers that aren't traditionally wage earners, such as independent contractors. That is an area where Maryland has a significantly large population, very specialized professions. And then you can see how it's come down. There's a whole complement of programs here. I won't dig into them all in detail, but we are continuing to push down the number of folks claiming UI. We're probably going to flatten out here for a bit of time, and that is to be expected. We expected that in the estimate, but certainly we'd like to see the rolls come down, particularly as kids get back to school in the fall. That will be a critical milestone. I wanted to just dive a little deeper into the economic impact payments. This is a simulation that we ran using tax returns to figure out what income classes in the households were benefiting and by how much. And you can see here we would estimate $5.5 billion impacting 2.1 million Maryland households out of 2.8. So a tremendous amount of assistance. The averages range, and again, it could be driven by one, your income classification, but also the number of kids you have. So you tend to be a joint return and you tend to have kids. Those tend to be in higher income classes, which is why the average income or average stimulus amounts there are a bit larger, almost touching 4,000. But just significant sums of money. And as we now know, many of these folks were able to sustain employment. So a lot of this income is coming in on top of their regular income. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing. The point of this was to stimulate demand. Again, to keep the impact of the recession from filtering out into the broader economy. And we can see here how it has sustained income in the aggregate. The blue line here is U.S. personal income. I'm going to go through a lot of charts that look at U.S. as opposed to just Maryland, because this really is it is very important that we sustain the national economy, the Maryland economy. The rising tide lifts all ships. That sort of approach, we'd be in big trouble if the national economy was not clicking. So I go all the way back here to illustrate what things looked like pre-Great Recession, and you can see the dip and a very, very small bounce there in the blue line back in early 2008. And that was some of the initial assistance that went out as a result of the Great Recession. And then, of course, things fall, a very slow expansion. And then here in the blue line, we see really almost no sign of a downturn in income. In fact, we see a surge well above pre-pandemic income levels. And more recently, we're coming back, but that is to a pre-pandemic trend level. So the income has really been sustained. The orange line is personal income excluding transfers. And that's what these stimulus payments are. That's what unemployment insurance is. It's also what Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are. So there's a lot of factors in that transfer payment grouping. But you can really see how far we would have fallen and so quickly had we not had these federal programs in place. And it has boosted spending. This is looking at national consumption expenditures, and it's looking at spending relative to the fourth quarter of 2019, so the last full quarter of pre-pandemic. And you can see by the second quarter of 2020, total spending had decreased 11%. And it was across the board at that point in time. It was in durable goods, non-durable goods, as well as services, although obviously the impact was acute in services. And then as the dollars really hit the bank accounts, we saw a surge in goods. Services were still constrained because you simply couldn't get them. The economy was shut down, or you didn't feel comfortable interacting with other people. Whereas for goods, we saw a major transformation of folks shopping online. Durable goods, we saw people doing a lot of work around their house. I mentioned that for many, the stimulus checks were on top of their regular paychecks. Folks started doing work on their homes. They were buying dishwashers, laundry machines, all sorts of things. And you see that is continuing to surge. This is an area where we expect to see near-term inflation. There just simply aren't enough goods to sustain those purchases. But we do expect to see that services line turn positive, perhaps in the second quarter of 2021, which is right now, and almost certainly in the third quarter, as the vaccination rates have improved, and we expect folks to start opening in a way more similar to pre-pandemic. The federal spending, and Mark hinted at this, is at how the money is rolling out. It is also intended to support state and local employment. And I show this here, again, going back to the Great Recession, because some of the federal programs were built on lessons learned from the Great Recession. While different, plenty of lessons learned. And what we saw was the state and local employment began to decline later than the private sector, but actually declined over the course of 4 years, well into the expansion, and never actually increased and at the rate that the private sector was. And that's because the manner in which state and local budgets were impacted. State and local budgets always feel the cash pain after the effect of the private sector. But the budgets just never really recovered for state and local government, and that was seen as a drag on the prior expansion. And those are generally regarded as middle-class jobs. So I think there's been a concerted effort at the federal level to put out some of this money in such a way, and it flows through the state and local governments to help sustain state and local employment well into the coming expansion. And I mentioned that the stimulus has minimized the contagion. This chart illustrates that. This is 2020. This is the withholding tax that the state of Maryland receives by industry. And you can see that through all of 2020, we only had 5 industries contracting. And they're ones that were directly impacted, especially accommodation and food services. State government is in there. And that was a bit of a surprise, I think, to many of us, but it does make some sense. State and local governments have seen reductions in employment. At one point, it was down 10%, but that's really related to K through 12 and university and community college, and the support staffs that would be on site had those programs been on site at the time. So similar to the V-shaped recovery that we've seen in employment, I do expect to see that state and local employment bounce back as the schools reopen in physical space. The labor impact is still significant. Everything I've shown is in the aggregate, and in the aggregate, things look good. But that does undermine the fact that there's still 151,000 Marylanders that are out of work. And that these folks that are out of work tend to have come from industries that are on the lower end of the pay stream. So they were less able to sustain a downturn in their income. So having the federal government step in and provide that assistance, and then the state to follow up with additional assistance, has been critical to helping these 151,000 Marylanders. And Mark alluded to the programs for apprenticeships. And I think we're going to see more out of the federal government in coming time about really helping support these folks through growing their skill base. We will always be in need of these jobs. The goal would be to make sure that folks have flexibility in the types of work that they are seeking. And just looking at the future, we have high expectations for future spending. The blue line there is savings. These are national dollars, again, going back in time to really illustrate what a more normal level of national spending is. And then to see that just surge with these stimulus and jobless payments. Unprecedented amounts of money going into savings accounts. Some of that is because they had more money than they needed. Some of that is because you couldn't even spend the money that you had, right? You couldn't go to the stores that you wanted to go to. On the flip side, a lot of that money has also gone to pay down credit card balances. So this is revolving credit cards, which is pretty normal credit cards for most Americans. We're seeing those balances go down through them being paid off and generally not used. What this means is that there's a lot of dry powder sitting out there in the economy that's going to hit the street, and it's going to be significant. So we're going to continue to see a burst in consumer spending probably over the next year, driven by money that is sitting in accounts right now. So some final thoughts. It's premature to really judge the economic impact of the federal money. Economists have an age-old adage of there is no free lunch. Everything you do has a cost. Right now, we've only seen the benefit of all of this federal spending. What is going to be the cost? General economic theory would suggest that we should see higher interest rates in the future. Higher interest rates will reduce future economic capabilities. We won't invest as much as we would have at lower rates. That will have a muting approach on the national economy as well as state revenues in the future. A comprehensive analysis of these federal dollars is going to be many years down the road. I think we still have a ways to go to see how certain sectors of the economy play out. The Federal Reserve is still buying residential and commercial mortgages. What's going to happen when that slows down? Local budgets have yet to be significantly impacted through their higher reliance on property taxes, especially in the commercial real estate sector. And then, of course, you have more abstract concepts. Will businesses shift to a greater deal to AI and robotics? The answer is going to be yes. The question is going to be to what degree and in which industries. And then has government put the programs in place to help those workers transition to new fields? So we have a long way to go here to play out through this pandemic relief. But so far, there's no denying that the federal programs have been, one, needed, two, well played, and three, significant to sustaining the economy. And I'll conclude my remarks there.
Thank you, Mr. Schaufele. That was an excellent presentation, and it really helped to have Marc's earlier presentation. Obviously, because of the excellent work that you and the Bureau of Revenue Estimates have done, I think we have a better idea now how important the federal pandemic relief programs were as far as preventing a collapse, not just of our economy in Maryland, but the entire country. And these relief packages, the three that have been mentioned so far that we're dealing with, obviously they were unbelievably partisan. They somewhat remain controversial as far as the actual relief provided and the amounts associated with stimulus checks and unemployment subsidies. But could you give us a sense, in addition to just saving the economy, I guess, or allowing us to have a quicker recovery, what would it have looked like if we didn't have the Paycheck Protection Program, if we didn't have the stimulus checks, if we didn't have the federal weekly unemployment subsidies?
Sure, that's a great question. And I mean, I think we would have seen that first scenario that the Bureau of Revenue Estimates presented back in May. We would have seen the labor market. You know, we lost 400,000 jobs. We're back to down 150,000. It would be easy to suspect that we might have lost up to 600,000 jobs, and we'd still be short in the neighborhood of 300,000 had we not had that federal relief. And perhaps even more importantly is, instead of this being the sort of V-shaped recovery overall, although it's not been for everyone, we would have been looking at a very long, dragged out U. We would have been talking labor market recovery all the way into 2023 or 2024, quite possibly. So just a staggering difference in trajectories.
Okay, and the billions of federal aid that have come in, as you mentioned, it isn't affected positively everybody, but we've really got a tale of two Marylands right now. White collar workers who are in the 2/3 sector that thankfully the low wage earner recession has not leaked into, I guess, or spread to. They've done more or less relatively okay. I wouldn't say well, but okay. But low wage earners and workers are really, particularly in the retail, hospitality, and restaurant industries, still, I think, correctly identified as just devastated financially because of the pandemic. Can you just talk for a little bit more about some of the data that you've got to underscore that point of the K-shaped recovery, I guess we're talking about?
Sure. I think the slide that I showed with the industries that are still contracted from employment really helps to illustrate that. If you look at the average wages in those industries that have lost the most jobs, restaurants and food service, the average wage is $20,000 a year. Pretty darn hard to live in Maryland off of $20,000 a year. So certainly these folks wouldn't have been well prepared to weather a downturn. So the fact that they were able to, perhaps the PPP funding was able to help keep them on the payroll to some degree. And if they weren't, then they would have qualified for the unemployment insurance. And if you were making $20,000 a year, the unemployment insurance with the extra $600 benefit was more substantial than your prior wage. So for many of these folks, that really not only created that sense of security for their livelihood, but it really enabled them to stay safe during the pandemic, right? If you were somebody that was especially more likely to be impacted by COVID, right? If you had pre-existing conditions or were over a certain age, you really needed that ability to not go to work. And I think the something that's not brought up enough within all of this is the response, not only in terms of dollars, but it was confidence. It was confidence for consumers and it was confidence for businesses. And that has really enabled folks to continue to live their lives and sustain the economy.
Okay, so despite that confidence and positive impact, how many small businesses in your estimation have, I guess, permanently shuttered their doors? How many do you think, despite receiving state and federal aid, are in danger right now of closing due to the economic effects of the pandemic? And I don't mean to put you on the spot. I know this is relatively rough estimating you're doing, but what do you think?
That's right. It is a rough estimate. I would put the number at somewhere between 35 and 45,000. I base that on the number of accounts that we have submitting withholding. So we have, withholding is due from basically anyone that employs a wage earner. And we've seen a drop of about 33,000 of those accounts submitting the withholding, which means that they're probably gone. Now, hopefully some of those will crop back up when things reopen to a greater degree. But that only covers our wage earners. Maryland has a vibrant economy with a lot of very small business owners, sole proprietorships, and the impact to them is likely far more significant and drives up that other about 10,000 that I would think might never come back.
So this comes under the category of all good things come to an end. What about the unprecedented infusion of federal aid coming to an end at some point? Especially as more Americans get vaccinations and we're getting back to some normalcy. I understand it's once again a prediction, but absent additional federal aid at the magnitude of the 3 federal COVID packages that you and Deputy Secretary have described, what is your sense about Maryland's economic recovery down the road?
Well, I'm very confident in our economic recovery down the road. I think that the money that has been put together by the feds for some of the infrastructure investment is going to plant the seeds for future growth. I'm highly encouraged by the bill that is yet to pass from the federal government, and I would view that as related to COVID relief. You mentioned the K-shaped recovery. And the reality is we have too many Americans working in jobs that pay wages that are below what they want to earn. And we need to find a way to put these folks, through improving their skills into higher paying positions, if that is indeed what they seek. And I think that the federal response and the state response at this point, as well as hopefully additional future federal funding, will plant the seeds for that. It's going to take years to play out. Mark alluded to the apprenticeship program, and the legislature and the governor have been boosting spending for workforce training and apprenticeship programs for the last several years. I hope that those programs become even more important in the very near future, and I expect that they will. That really is the greatest opportunity facing us is workforce development. We have a very smart, able, willing population. If we can just plug some holes for them and give them the opportunity to boost their skills, I think they'll respond, and I think we'll all benefit from that.
Okay, terrific. Let's take a few questions. Mr. Hildebrand, do you have any remarks or question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, and thank you, Andy. Did have two questions for you. The first one, in your slide presentation, you noted that there was a 5.4% decrease in the labor participation rate. Are you expecting that to come back and gain, or are we expecting that to, given your previous comments, to stay lower or worse?
I expect to pull those jobs back. There's been, the comptroller mentioned a lot of the partisan discussions that have been going on through this whole process, and that's always unfortunate. But much was made about this last jobs report. Is it because we're paying extra unemployment insurance? Is it we have?
I think we just lost you. Yeah, you're cut off. So let's move on to something.
Am I back in?
There we go. Good. You're back again, Andy. What did you want to repeat your last couple of sentences?
Sure. My AirPods failed. Apologies. Yeah, really threw off my trajectory there too. No, I think it's going to take the combination of things getting back to normal to really see the labor force come back. It's not going to be any one factor that drives that. It's going to be the culmination of folks being able to get back to work, and some of those financial incentives drying up. It's all of those things working in unison. It's never just one thing. So I would expect that as we get really into the fall, especially the late fall, that we'll start to see labor participation get back to where it was.
Thank you. Do you have a second question?
I do. Given the recent reports that I've seen from the feds, some starting to come out from other states, can you give us an estimate, or if not now, sometime, when you've had a chance, on anticipated fraud levels for this $26 billion in spending that Maryland is responsible for?
Sure. I don't think I can give an estimate yet. I think we've heard some reports out of California that have just unbelievable numbers. I think I've seen percentages there that put it at 15 to 20% of unemployment insurance might have been paid out to fraudulent benefactors. The reality of this world is, and as many of you know, we work in my office on the fraud model for the comptroller's office. It is a constant game of cat and mouse. These people that are perpetrating fraud are organized, they're smart, they've got tremendous resources, and anywhere where they can find financial transactions, they are constantly prodding and trying to get in there. And this has really opened up the door. I would argue, I mean, you hate to ever say any kind of fraud is worthwhile, but you have to work on, you can't stand up a fraud program overnight, right? These take years to develop. And it was critical that we got that money out the door. And I mean that as a nation, that money hit the streets. And sadly, some of that fraud is the cost of doing business. But I do hope that this work group continues to investigate that, because we need to learn lessons from that and make sure that we're prepared as a state to limit that at all times, but particularly if something like this is to occur again.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, sir.
General Accounting Division Director Sandy Zink. Sandy, you want to ask a question?
No, I don't have anything. Thank you, Andy.
Excellent. Mr. Riley.
Andy, I just had one quick question for you. As far as lessons learned that the Comptroller's already alluded to and what we're trying to do you have a feeling between the stimulus checks and the unemployment benefits, the extension and whatnot, which one of those played a greater impact on buoying up Maryland's economy?
I'd be really hard pressed to pick one. I think they certainly worked together to get the response we needed. I guess I would pick unemployment simply because we know that went to people that were in need. In many cases, these stimulus checks went to folks that didn't need them. It's not to say they shouldn't have still gotten them, because that helps spur the demand that has helped lift the whole economy. But so if I had to really pick one, I would go with the UI, just because it was rolled out directly to folks we know were injured by the pandemic.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, you've now become an honorary member of the work group. So if you would care to ask Andy a question or not, that's fine. Go ahead.
No, I don't think I have a question, just more of a comment. I always appreciate seeing Andy's charts. He always pulls out some statistics that sort of we've, never seen, or is it sort of very enlightening. And he does this through all our Bureau of Revenue Estimate meetings. I think it's sort of very informative, and it helps to explain a lot of why we're at. I think the thing that strikes me as most amazing was this chart sort of that looked at sort of where revenues stand now compared to where they stood almost at this time last year, right? If you look at the estimates for the current year, we're off just a nudge. And for the next year, we're actually up. So it almost, we kind of lead you to believe it's like, what have we been doing for the last year, except for going through one of the most, stressful periods in, American history. And there's been lots of impacts, but you don't really see them in the revenues.
Somehow lemonade was made out of lemons, but it was a dire situation a year ago. I recall that very clearly. So we're in a much better place now. And I love the concept of best practices as well as lessons learned. Obviously, the fraud detection infrastructure is something, as Andy said, needs to be, and David Hildebrand knows this, we need to invest in it. We can't wait around for the next one, because otherwise we're looking like Columbia Gas or whatever that ransomware incident recently was. So everybody, thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentations. I know we went over our time a little bit, and obviously everyone is available for questions, follow-up questions from the press or et cetera, whoever might be listening to this. So thank you very much for getting us off on a good foot, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot.